for now, I'd like to shift over from something you touched on in your paper on pediatric health. So the question around, plant-based, animal-based, when we talk about kids becomes even more, let's call it compelling, because there are some important things to consider on the nutrition side, as well as even if we talk sort of policy. But can you share with us, what are some of the nutrients here that we need to really be thinking about when it comes to kids' health and a 100% plant-based diet?
Yeah. So I think you're absolutely right that the risk of sort of a 100% plant-based diet or a vegan diet, or even a diet low in animal source foods is higher for young children, especially young children who are just starting to eat solid foods, who have really increased requirements and are actually growing faster than at any other point in life. That 6 to 23 month period, their brain is rapidly developing. And so there are a lot of essential nutrients that they require during that time. And children have small stomachs. They can't really consume a large quantity of food. So the foods that they do eat need to be nutrient dense. There's also this sort of factor of, it's not just about the single nutrients, it's the complex food matrix and the cofactors that can really improve growth and development. But when we look at specific nutrients, there's a set of micronutrients, and then there are sort of like essential amino acids and essential fatty acids that can be lacking. And this is especially evident when, in the context that I often work are in low and middle income countries in Africa and in South Asia. And what we see is that, iron deficiency is very common. The requirements are really high in young children. Zinc deficiency is also common. And then oftentimes things like vitamin B12, calcium, vitamin A can also be lacking, as well as folate. And so many of those nutrients are actually in their most dense and bioavailable forms in animal source foods. So you have heme iron in red meat and other animal source foods. You have forms that are, zinc, there's no anti-nutrient like phytate, which is sort of in the plant-based form, and pulses like beans, peas, and lentils. So you may have a similar amount of zinc or iron, but the inhibition, it's not as bioavailable. Yeah. And so we actually notice that, and it's a bit more problematic, especially for younger children who don't consume enough. And then, of course, like protein is one thing, and there's actually estimated to be about 1 billion people with not enough protein intake in terms of recommended intakes globally. But even those who do have, meet the requirement or the recommended intakes, they often have, especially in young children, low circulating essential amino acids, and that's actually impacting their growth and development. So it's not that just having enough protein is enough. You really need to make sure that the diets, have enough of essential amino acids. And the same thing for essential fatty acids, omega-3s, the long chain form like DHA and EPA, much more bioavailable, and plant source forms are usually converted at about 10 to 1 or less than that. And so all of these nutrients kind of act together, and it's hard to say which is most important. But what we do know is that having a diet that's low in animal source foods for a young child and even adolescents as they're growing and developing is typically not optimal. Now, if you have access to a really diverse range of healthy plant foods and things like dark green leafy vegetables, and you're consuming lots of them, pulses like lentils and whatnot, and you have access to fortified foods and supplements, you can be okay. But it's something that, it's not necessarily given enough attention.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those ones where in the Western, if we're in a middle upper class demographics, there's kind of more bandwidth, there's more room for error, let's call it, when we have exposure to these foods that we can get. We should talk about the diverse foods. We've got support from doctors, dietitians. But when we get to lower middle income, even in Western countries, and of course in other countries, then that room for error gets really slim, doesn't it? We're much more prone to sort of deficiency. And you cite in your paper how a lot of professional organizations like the Belgian Royal Academy of Medicine or the Swiss Federal Commission for Nutrition actually discourage veganism or vegetarianism in very young populations. And that even the Italian Pediatric Organization stated that vegan and vegetarian diets are inadequate for a lot of the, the neuropsychomotor development. And so I'm sure some people listening in are saying, geez, he's really anti 100% plant-based diet. I think it's obviously, as you're presenting, these are just an area that we really need to be focused and concerned on, because the repercussions later on are really significant here, right?
Absolutely. And I would probably just to make sure that I don't get hit from the plant-based community, that it's been pointed out to me on social media that there are many national organizations that actually do support a well-planned vegan diet. So It's mixed, and I don't know what the total number is, but I think the point is that there is an increased risk of inadequate nutrient intake. I mean, that's just the case. When you restrict a very nutrient dense food source from the diet, it's going to be an increased risk. I think more power to people who can and want to do that in a way that's healthy. But I think when we're talking about kids who don't have control of their diet, I think we have a responsibility to make sure they're getting the nutrients they need, because as you said, you can have lifelong consequences. This is more the case in low and middle income countries if you have stunted growth, if you don't develop during these key stages. But certainly you're not going to have optimal health if you don't pay attention to the nutrients that you need to consume. And so pay attention to things like iron if you're going without animal source foods. Check iron levels for children, for kids, adolescents. Check zinc, making sure B12 is there. I think those nutrients, and then DHA and EPA as well.
I mean, it's a theme that you talk about throughout the paper, this idea of sort of context and where are we in the world and what's the culture, because this is going to really influence the strategy that we're using. And when 4 out of 8 food groups contributing to the World Health Organization's minimum dietary diversity score are coming from animals, then this is something that needs to be taken into consideration. It's, you share a great graphic in the paper around, the quantity of food from organ meats like liver compared to some of the plant-based alternatives. And again, it's not to pit one versus the other, but it's to say that these can provide a pretty valuable source, particularly in these lower to middle income countries. Because what was it about, the portion of organ meat would be 100 times the portion of a pulse to achieve the similar amounts of things like iron, zinc, vitamin A, B12. That's pretty profound when we're talking about malnutrition around the world being quite prevalent, some 750 million to 800 million children, more or less. Is that right?
Yeah, I think when you look at the numbers for undernutrition, 150 million children under 5 are stunted. So that's sort of, they're not growing at the rate that they need to grow. 570 million women, 15 to 49, have anemia. And then we're doing a study on deficiencies, and over 1 billion people have deficiencies, and it's probably larger than that. So it is important. And I think in the paper, we have this analysis where we look at, here's a range of foods that are from animal source foods and plant source foods. And these are sort of nutrients that are commonly lacking. Now, there are a lot of nutrients that are not listed there that can be problematic. Like in high income countries, you generally see magnesium, potassium, vitamin E, those can be problematic as well. But the point here is that we have the most evidence on these nutrients globally, and they're actually causing severe impacts to health. And so when you look at those nutrients, you're absolutely right. There's orders of magnitude different levels of nutrient density of these key nutrients when you take into account bioavailability. So things like liver, small fish, eggs, ruminant meat, you can have really a lot smaller quantities to get the same nutrient value of these key nutrients. And so I think people don't really realize that. And there's sort of a misconception that nutrient requirements are the same regardless of what your diet is. That's really not the case. For example, if you have a vegetarian diet or a vegan diet, the requirements for iron and zinc are actually much higher than they are if you have an omnivorous diet. And so you can't have the same targets. They're actually higher targets. And that's the case in the US and the RDA. And there's that recommendation in there, and that's kind of worldwide.
Yeah, and a big one. I mean, you talked about iron. I mean, I think it's about 1.7 times the RDA if it's purely from plant-based. So it just adds a layer of challenge. And again, not that it can't be done, and we see it done successfully in the West, but these are, I like the theme in the paper of just saying, well, depending on where we are in the world, we can't have a blanket approach of trying to shift all of the food system in one direction, because we're going to leave a heck of a lot of people potentially very exposed. And shifting gears a little bit, that brings us to the concept of, hey, we're using technology. We're going to be able to, we can already grow meat in the lab. Can we use this to replace the meat that we're consuming? Obviously, we're replicating the macronutrients and the key vitamins and minerals, but can this actually really replace animal source foods?
Yeah, that's a good question that I'm not going to answer directly, but I will say,
no worries.
I'm going to be looking into this more. I'm going to working on a paper now that's kind of reviewing the nutrition environmental impacts of animal source foods, and I want to do a sort of deep dive into these alternative options. I think one thing we know for sure, and this is from a colleague of mine, Stefan Van Vliet, who looked at sort of the plant-based meat alternatives, that they can have the same nutrition facts panel. So like you said, macronutrients are matched. They can even have, to in some cases, some of the micronutrients can be similar.
Mm-hmm.
But when you look at them from a metabolomics perspective, you look at the actual complexity of the compounds in those foods, which there are many thousands, they're actually mostly different. So there's over 90% difference. Now, there really is not a lot of evidence to say which is healthier or what are the health risks or benefits, but there is at least this point that they're not the same. And I think it's an area where we need to look into it further. The other thing, the food matrix is a big factor in terms of risk of non-communicable disease and nutrient absorption. And if you have a food that has its matrix preserved, there's sort of a slower breakdown of those components. And what we actually see when you talk about ultra processed foods that have been highly processed, the food matrix is destroyed or altered significantly. And I think that can lead to hyperpalatability. You have increased consumption where our appetite or our satiety regulation mechanisms are not functioning properly. They don't know what to do with that. And so I think that's an important piece. But there are a lot of potential, like you said, lab-based or cell-based meat, potential options, mycoproteins, precision fermentation, dairy. I mean, these are things I don't know a lot about, but that are on my radar. And I think if you look practically, they're probably going to play a larger role going forward, and an increasingly larger role to replace some animal source foods. But I think what we need to just be careful of is to just be evidence-based. Try to look holistically at the implications of this. What are the resource implications, the use of fossil fuels or energy, and then just let's make decisions that are based on that. I think ultimately there are still a lot of reasons if we think about this sort of push to reduce, heavily restrict or eliminate animal source foods. There's gastronomic legacy with certain animal source foods that have been around for a long time. They're rich, like, cultural traditions that are, animal source foods are a key part of. So I think in addition to the many other factors, livelihoods, ecosystem function, thinking about regenerative type production, there's a lot of reasons, I think, to include livestock in food production.